Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at early Mesopotamia in our study of ancient history, a framework for the Bible. There is a giant, in fact, it's probably the greatest desert system in the world, spanning 2 continents, stretching from Africa all the way to the Hindu Kush, 5,000 miles. And that desert system is interrupted by a narrow crescent-shaped oasis caused by 3 rivers. We talked about this already, this fertile crescent that takes in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and then is connected by what we call Canaan, the land of Canaan. Our focus is going to be on this double river system of the Euphrates and Tigris. This is a river valley, and as such, early settlers were attracted to this because people are always looking for water in a place where they're going to build their cities. And there was, especially in the southern part of Mesopotamia, a whole series of smaller streams and parts of it are swamp, but a river system. And this was added to by the people that settled there as they dug canals and use that for extensive irrigation. Now, oftentimes a society that has limited access, like Egypt, when you're going to Egypt, there's desert on 3 sides and the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and that stops a lot of unwanted neighbors from coming in. But that's not the case in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, they're going to have noisy neighbors coming from every direction, and that's going to lead to lots of unrest. The climate of Mesopotamia can be rather harsh. In the summertime, it regularly gets up to 110, 120 degrees, even in the shade. Winter times, likewise, can be harsh. This means that there's a difference between the outlooks and the way people viewed things in Mesopotamia versus in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, they tended to be legalistic in their religious outlook, looking more to the letter of the law. In Egypt, by contrast, they had more of an ethical outlook on life with a focus on the spirit of the law. In Mesopotamia, their art and literature usually reflects a gloomy, pessimistic outlook on life. Although you do have a season of pessimistic literature in Egypt, they tend to overall demonstrate a cheerful resignation to the problems of life. In Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and the Tigris flooded unexpectedly and often killed those who were caught. These rivers came to be feared and dreaded, even though they were used for the irrigation that we described. In Egypt, the Nile flooded on a very regular cycle. They could plan their calendar with it, and the Egyptians came to expect and even to depend upon that flooding. In fact, they eventually began to worship the Nile. In Mesopotamia, they were surrounded on all sides by hostile forces, and people lived in constant fear of invasion. In Egypt, as I said at the outset, Egypt has those natural boundaries in the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the desert to the east, south, and west, which usually kept out noisy neighbors, kept out invaders. Mesopotamia lived from day to day always in fear of invasion and death. In Egypt, they looked forward instead to immortality and a life after death. In Mesopotamia, the tendency of people, I guess maybe all people have a tendency towards being selfish and practical, but in Egypt, they looked at themselves at least as much more giving and idealistic. Now, in looking at the history, we want to talk first about the pre-literary period. The earliest secular sources of information outside of the Bible come to us from the study of tools and pottery and bones and things like that. The problem with dating exclusively by those sorts of things is that later cultures might tend to exhibit those same sort of primitive things at certain times. And also, you can have other disasters that come and sort of send you send you a few steps backwards in the culture wars. Next we come to the proto-literary period. This is the period when they're just beginning to invent writing. Our earliest samples of writing begin around 3500 BC. What we're looking at here is a clay tablet from the city of Uruk in the land of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia. And most of that early writing deals either with religious uses, maybe religious and cultic uses, and also cooking recipes. That tells us something about people of the ancient world. They're rather like us. They're interested in a relationship with God, but also in just the daily sorts of things. Some of the people groups that we're going to see in and around Mesopotamia during this period, first of all, the Sumerians. They're going to be located in southern Mesopotamia. They are a Hamitic group. Next we have the Akkadians, a Semitic group occupying the northern part of Mesopotamia. And we're going to see those two groups, first the Sumerians gaining the upper hand, and then later on the Akkadians will do so. To the east of both these groups we have the Guti mountain tribes to the east, also the Elamites, a Semitic group to the southeast of the Guti, and finally the Medes, a Indo-European group. So we've got folks from representing all three sons of Noah in these early people groups in and around Mesopotamia. Now the early dynastic period begins with the rise to power of Kish and Erech, two of the Sumerian cities in southern Mesopotamia. And these cities each one develops a dynastic form of government where they each have a king who leaves the kingdom to his son and grandson. The kingship stays within the family with these kings, and other cities gradually follow suit, so that we have Ur, although Ur is not going to be a top contender for the power struggle that right now exists between Kish and Erech. We also have Lagash and Babylon, although Babylon during this period is fairly insignificant politically. So it's during this period that we have Gilgamesh. He is the king of Erech around 2650 BC. Comes to power and has such a great kingship that all sorts of legends develop. We have the Gilgamesh epic, which contain all sorts of fanciful stories about his conquests and what he was able to do. Although following his reign, there's an interlude in which the Elamites from the east come in, and they're able to dominate the Sumerian affairs. Because the wars between Kish and Erech and all these cities fighting each other have so weakened them that they come under that sort of authority. Eventually, the king of Lagash, Ur-Nanshi, around 2500 BC, he rises to power and succeeds in pushing out the Elamites, and for a bit, Lagash is going to be the supreme power around. The grandson of Ur-Nanshi, Natum, he's going to unify all of Sumer, all of southern Mesopotamia. Notice the upper panel here. We've got a picture of the warriors going into battle. They have their big, giant, rectangular shields, probably made of some sort of wicker, and they're carrying spears. And so it's through force of arms that he is succeeding and managing to bring his will over the surrounding city-states. And not only that, he's going to invade Elam. Elam had exercised their dominance over Sumer. Now he returns the favor. Finally, we have Lugal-Zaggisi, who is going to claim, we have an inscription of his that says that he exercised sovereignty. His domain went throughout all the lands between the upper and the lower seas. That is, he's claiming that his kingdom goes from the Persian Gulf in the east all the way to the Mediterranean in the west. And again, he's over Kish and Erech and Ur and Babylon and Lagash. But truth be told, whereas he does possibly extend influence that far, his actual kingdom really doesn't extend much past southern Mesopotamia. It's going to be Sargon the Great that actually takes that claim and makes a reality of it. Sargon is certainly a colorful character. He's going to die around 2330 BC. We don't know exactly when he was born. There is an extensive birth legend regarding his origins. He says, "My mother was a high priestess. My father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is Azuparanu, which is situated on the banks of the Euphrates. My high priestess mother conceived me. In secret she bore me. She sent me in a basket of rushes." Who does that sound like? "Sealed with bitumen, she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose over me. The river bore me and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water." Like I said, that sounds a bit familiar to us from the biblical story of Moses. I think the reason that it sounds familiar is because it happens so often. Just like a story today might talk about somebody who their mother went to have an abortion and somehow the child survived, and that happens not all that often, but it's not an unknown story. There's certainly lots of people that go into abortion clinics. This was the ancient equivalent of going into an abortion clinic. He goes on to say in the story, "Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. And while I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love, and for 4, and we're not quite sure that something's missing there, however many years, he says, I exercised kingship." Now, the reason it's missing is, remember, these are clay tablets, and they're after all 4,000 years old. They come under a bit of weathering, and sometimes portions of them have crumbled and are virtually unreadable. So he becomes, well, perhaps the gardener, as he tells the story, or as some accounts have it, the royal cupbearer. And somehow he becomes the king. Now, when we say that he becomes the king, it's interesting to note his name, Sargon. Sar is Akkadian for prince. In fact, it reminds us a little bit of Sarah, princess, both in Akkadian as well as in Hebrew. And then Gon is the Akkadian word for, an illegitimate child. And then you put the prefix to it, and that negates it. So literally, Sargon means the not illegitimate, but the legitimate prince. It's an interesting name, because if somebody names themselves the legitimate prince, well, maybe it's because they're not. So here's these terms that mean prince and legitimate, and like I said, he probably isn't either one of those. But he does rise to the kingship, probably through force of arms, overthrowing the kingdom. And he's going to build the empire which was only claimed by his predecessors. His reign will establish his domain indeed from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean. Now, Sargon is Akkadian, not Sumerian, but he has exercised his sovereignty over all of Mesopotamia, taking in kingdoms such as Mitanni, we haven't talked about them yet, the Akkadians, Sumer, eventually turns his attention toward Elam, and he sets up his capital in the city of Akkad, from which we get Akkadian. I can't put that on the map because we don't know exactly where it is, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of central Mesopotamia, but that's guesswork. Because the city has never been located. Remember, when it comes to ancient history, the earlier we go, the more unknowns there are, and sometimes there are big gaps in our records. Sargon gives way to, when he finally dies, he gives way to first his couple of sons, and then his grandson, Naram Sin. We actually have his victory stele, probably one of the more capable rulers since Sargon himself, and he defeats an alliance of 32 Elamite kings, but toward the end of his reign, he suffers a crushing defeat at the hands of the Guti. And now the Guti will come in and rule over Mesopotamia for about 100 years. This will be Mesopotamia's Dark Ages, from about 2220 to about 2120 BC. The Guti will reign, and then finally they will be driven out. And when they are driven out, it will be, first of all, by a man by the name of Utu Hegel from the city of Erech, who will drive them out. But then after a short reign, Utu Hegel will be deposed. The story goes that he was inspecting one of the canals, and the edge of the canal gave way. He fell into the canal and drowned. And the one who will come to power after him will be Ur-Nammu, who is the king of the city of Ur. You have to wonder sometimes if it's been suggested that maybe Ur-Nammu was out there working on canals and maybe undermining some of the banks. I don't know if that's true or not. But we have now the third dynasty of Ur, which will be the high water mark for the city of Ur. And now for 100 years, around 2100 to 2000 BC. Remember, we're painting with a very broad brush here. But for about 100 years, we're going to have Ur as the major city of the Sumerian civilization. This will be the golden age of Ur, literally, not just figuratively. We have wonderful works of gold and artistry that have been recovered from this period. Also, we have a great amount of documents, literally thousands upon thousands of tablets. Now you would think with that we would have a sort of a very thoroughgoing history. That's unfortunately not the case. Those tablets are more often than not concerned with just day-to-day things and record keeping, but still there's a great amount of information. Ur during this period exercised a very thoroughgoing hierarchy and organization in which all the people of Mesopotamia, especially of southern Mesopotamia, here in Sumer, everyone had their place. It became a very socialistic society in the sense that the king ran everything. And whether you were a slave or an aristocrat or a commoner, the king really exercised a great deal of authority over everyone's life. Remember, they don't have money, and so people would be paid in food supplies, and you would, if you were a working man, you would get a certain amount of food. If you were a woman, you'd get a bit less than that. If you were a child, well, it would go to your mother, and she would share however much she wanted to. But it was a very aristocratic form of government with the king on top and his will coming down to everybody within the kingdom. It was also a time when Ur was able to exercise its influence. What we're looking at here is the royal standard of Ur. On the backside we just looked at before shows the piece. You turn it over to the other side and you see the warfare. Notice the chariots with their big, giant, heavy wooden wheels. They're going to make these devastating charges like not at all. But they're just big wagons that will roll into combat. And we have the infantry, the cavalry, and they're able to exercise the authority of the king everywhere within the land. It will be hundreds of years after this that a new invention will eventually revolutionize warfare, and that's going to be the chariot with spoked wheels. But at this time, the wheel is a big, solid wooden affair. We also have the formation of the ziggurats. Now, these had already come into play. In fact, we have what I take to be the very first one in Babylon, and Genesis chapter 11 tells us the story of that. But they are not limited to Babylon. Every city would have its temple tower, its ziggurat. The one in Ur has been restored. You can see a good portion of it right here in modern day, with its stairway going up to the sky, as this would be the place of centralized worship. You would worship in the high place, and in Mesopotamia there's not a lot of high places because it's all down low. So you'd want to get high, and they would build these artificial mountains, these artificial temple towers. We are indebted to Sir Leonard Woolley, lived from 1880 to 1960, for our knowledge of Ur. He was the archaeologist who excavated this area beginning in 1922, did a marvelous job. It was Woolley who discovered the ziggurat of Ur, and it has subsequently been largely restored. He also noted that there were flood layers. Now, Woolley, I think, was probably trying to generate funds, and people back when he was doing his work were very interested in the Bible. And so he claimed to have found Noah's flood. I'm not sure if it's really Noah's flood that he found, or maybe just another flood, but he did find flood layers and reported them. Sometimes the reports of archaeologists, at least in the past, have looked intentionally to try to link their finds. In fact, it's not just in the past. We see it even today, trying to link their finds with the Bible, knowing that things like that will help to generate additional funds. We always have to be careful and analyze the finds. Sometimes if it's too good to be true, it might not be true. And so we want to be careful about hearing a report and immediately jumping to the conclusion that it is authentic. We always want to carefully analyze and carefully check out the claims, yes, even those made by archaeologists. But at the same time, we're thankful to Woolley for his work in uncovering this city and in giving us what is going to be the background for a good portion of the book of Genesis. Near the close of the 21st century, a Semitic people known as the Amaru, the Bible refers to them as the Amorites, began to move into Mesopotamia from the northwest. And initially the armies of Sumer and Ur were able to hold them off, but then the Elamites used this opportunity to revolt and even to attack, declaring themselves to be independent. And so Ur found itself with enemies on two sides, and as a result, it was only a matter of time before the city of Ur fell to this invasion around 2000 BC. And it's at around this time, maybe just a bit before this, that Abraham receives his call from God to relocate, to leave Ur, and to move to a new land, a promised land, the land of Canaan. And for him, as well as for us, that will change everything. But we'll look at that next time.